Let's talk about the material in Chapter 10 in our text for the Sociology 102 Intro to Social course. The chapter focuses on the concept of poverty and looks at it from a couple of different perspectives. First, we have to define what the concept entails. And so this may seem obvious, but it's important to point out the two aspects or facets of it. The idea of deprivation as a condition, and that the nature of the deprivation is economic. That might seem like it lends itself to remedies, but I think that because you're talking about human behavior, things are a little more complicated than that. When you look at the remedies that are offered to deprivation, you would end up thinking that somebody who is in a position to be able to make choices, that a person would take advantage of those resources only so long as is necessary and then to move on. But there may be perverse incentives which would end up actually producing counterproductive behavior, so that we may have a situation where individuals find it more useful to stay on state aid. What do I mean? Well, consider the situation of an individual who is receiving some form of state aid, and that state aid could include payment of child care. Well, the problem is that for the person to be able to get off of the state aid and to be able to get a full-time job, there's now the added cost of the child care, since the state aid won't cover it any longer. So even though it seems contrary to the intent of providing the state aid, you end up finding individuals who believe or conclude that staying with state aid makes more sense than going out and getting work. And who can argue with that kind of logic, especially when you consider the issues of having responsibility for the children? Along those lines, you may also have unintended consequences. That is, that policies that are implemented produce effects that seem counterproductive, or much like the perverse incentives, work against the purpose or the idea behind a particular policy. What does that mean? Well, early in the history of one form of state aid called food stamps, we were finding that people were seeing them as the functional equivalent of money, and so they were easy enough to be able to transfer around. They were literally pieces of paper. So one of the consequences is to come up with a requirement that these be kept within the coupon booklet that they were issued with. But there were certain ways to get around that as well. You just ended up selling the entire booklet for a discounted price to be able to get the money, for example. The way to get around that today has been the EBT, Electronic Benefits Transfers card, so that with a picture ID as a precondition, we could end up seeing people using the stamps as they were intended, rather than as a sort of alternative currency. Perhaps what makes the issue of poverty difficult has to do with the engenderment or the creation of a culture of poverty, that people end up adopting certain practices that would seem alien, if not outright repellent, even by a middle-class mainstream society. So you might find that there is multifamily households, illegal work, serial relationships instead of marriage, multi-generational living arrangements. All of those may make more sense when you're dealing with endemic or widespread poverty. In fact, when you see these adaptations, things that could include the pooling of community resources, you may find that they have taken on a life of their own. They seem almost resilient and resistant to any sort of change or extinguishment, and that this may be something that you'll find as being perversely quite common in certain state aid recipients. Some would even go so far as to suggest that the culture of poverty comes out of an element of shame, that the simple fact of seeking some form of payment system like with welfare is seen to be part of this kind of self-defeating behavior associated with poverty, that it seems like an act of shame to do this. The hypothesis has not necessarily been tested, but it has a certain amount of intuitive appeal to it. The remedy, though, is going to be apparently just to stop the welfare system altogether, which on the one hand will of course extinguish the behavior, but on the other hand it still leaves people in dire circumstances. Another mechanism to try to encourage people to work would be the idea of the so-called negative income tax. And what that arrangement would mean was that individuals would end up getting money back depending on how much they had worked. So the beauty of this arrangement is that people can only take advantage of this if they work. In a sense, it's the reverse of what people have traditionally seen with a state welfare type policy. That kind of a policy ends up reducing aid as people find work. This would not necessarily provide any aid at all unless people worked. And that the idea that there would be some additional check forthcoming based on one's work effort might be enough of an incentive to get people to work. The idea of poverty may end up creating subclasses of individuals, such as the underclass, those people who are so poor that they see that engaging in deviant behavior might actually make sense. The problem with that, in the eyes of some, is that this could end up characterizing groups of individuals who are no different from you or from me, because they are responding to economic incentives. That there is a sense of rationality to them, and I don't mean rational in a sort of colloquial sense of sane, but rational in terms of objectively evaluating and weighing particular possibilities that are available to them. Others end up saying that it's not so much a question of people who've decided to choose to cheat a system or to rely on benefits that are available to them, but rather this is a result of a number of societal forces coming to change the way that we see a deindustrialization in our society, so that low-skill manual labor jobs disappear and thereby reduce the number of opportunities for individuals to be able to earn. The idea of globalization, where some work ends up being shipped to lower-wage countries, generally speaking, work that doesn't require a great deal of education or skills, which might mean a segment in our society that otherwise can't do certain kinds of works lose out on the job opportunities that even they would be able to do. Some go so far as to suggest that the idea of poverty is something that is endemic to genes, and this is the so-called bell curve thesis. Part of the difficulty with that is, why would you have genes that encourage people to be poor? What is the advantage? If you accept the premise that genes are favorable mutations that end up increasing the likelihood of survival of individuals, it would seem as though you're arguing that genes have figured out that poverty is a good thing, to the point of suggesting even in turn that as long as there's state aid programs, that genes will gravitate towards being able to take advantage of this. The other flaw of the bell curve hypothesis is that if it is genetic that people end up being poor, there's really no remedy. You might get into some of the scary thoughts too, that if it's genetic in nature, we end up implementing a program of sterilization to prevent those genes from being passed on, which has got some real problems when you look at similar types of arrangements historically in the 20th century. Just exactly what is going on when it talks about poverty, look at the moving to opportunity experiments, which ended up using housing vouchers as a way to pull people out of a bad situation. In general, people who had flexibility in choosing where to go with their housing vouchers had better outcomes. And outcomes there might end up meaning academic improvement among children, better physical health, less stress in their lives. The success of moving to opportunity study seems like the antithesis of the bell curve hypothesis, because it does show and suggest that there's something that the state can do, and that in so doing these kinds of things, the state will end up improving the lot of individuals who are suffering. Where does that leave government efforts to improve the situation? Well, in the 1960s in the United States, a series of programs from the federal government collected under the umbrella title of the War on Poverty seems to suggest that poverty is worse today than it was historically. And by worse, I mean that in part the gap between earning levels has been widening, leading to a kind of economic segregation, ensuring that those who are poor remain poor. That if you find that these individuals are in fact able to get work, that they may end up needing to travel farther and farther to get to that work. So they may end up working in communities like a ski town like Aspen, Colorado, but have to drive from great distances to be able to get to the work, because that's the only places where they can end up being able to afford housing. What does poverty mean in its practical terms? Well, consider poverty and the fact that we live in a society with plenty. Absolute poverty would be an instance where we find that a family's income falls below the level needed to be able to support the family in terms of being able to purchase food. This leads to, at least historically, the so-called official poverty line, which at one point in time was based on costs, a cost-benefit analysis on what people need to be able to survive. The problem with that is that it has become something of a political measure, because if in fact the poverty line is adjusted for, say, inflation, the increase in the costs of goods, that may end up increasing the amount of financial commitment that the federal government has to make. So having turned it into something of the equivalent of a political football, we now find that the poverty line might in fact be amazingly low, and even so we still have a segment of our society falling beneath its level. What does that mean for those who are above the poverty line that hasn't been adjusted for inflation? What we might have is people who have relative poverty. They may end up not having so low a level of poverty, but it may mean that their options are so constrained because the median income is insufficient to be able to do certain kinds of things. What does poverty mean for children? What impact does it have? There's the obvious. What is it like for children not to have certain kinds of material goods? And there's a way to separate the issue of what constitutes material goods as necessary for the life of a child. Clothing, for example, might be viewed as more critical than the availability of a computer or some other kinds of toys. The effects of poverty on the lives of children may also be measured in terms of parental stress, where parents lack the resources to be able to provide for a stable home environment. That low income might be reflected in unstable employment, may mean or may reflect a lack of cultural resources, that there's a sense of inferiority engendered in that particular family. Perhaps even in a worst case scenario, there's a higher level of domestic violence in this instance. Or there may be even a different argument about the impact of poverty. And it may be that those families where you have one or both parent unable to produce a certain level of income, it may not be possible for those things to change, even with the availability of some sort of state programs. Why is it that poverty is the kind of problem that it is in this country? There's a couple hypotheses that might explain this. For example, you'll find that the gap between those with resources versus those with few resources might be accounted for because of the lack of history of feudalism in this country. Under the feudal system, we had individuals who were essentially beholden to the property owner to farm the land and to be able to pay off the use of that land with the products that they ended up generating. So that tended to be a stable arrangement. It also seemed to create implicitly a societal arrangement whereby the property owner, if you will, under contemporary terms, the state, ends up providing the kinds of resources needed, so that when you have modern societies and you no longer have feudalism, the idea that the state would be the source of some form of care might not seem as alien as it does in this society, which doesn't have a history of feudalism on the one hand. But on the other hand, it does have a history of racism, where we saw very determinedly a practice of owning certain types of people as property, and what that meant to this particular nation, including something like the American Civil War and the damage that was fraught, also the decades of legal segregation against those people who had formerly been enslaved. What we end up seeing well into the 1960s is that states were going along with discriminatory practices, even though by 1954 and the decision of Brown versus Board of Education, that legal segregation was no longer appropriate. Perhaps doubly perversely, not only does the history of owning people as property make our country different from those that had a feudal society, but it also ended up stigmatizing and disenfranchising an entire segment of society, that this segment of society may be more vulnerable to the effects of poverty because they've been at a disadvantage for a longer period of time. So that poverty may be relative, it doesn't spread out over the entire American population to the same way. And that when there's discussions about a so-called societal safety net, in fact, what happens is that that net fails only a segment of our society, that not everyone is poor in equal proportion to their numbers as a member of overall society. So we may see that poverty is linked to, whether intended or not, discrimination and segregation. Those are a few thoughts about poverty as addressed in Chapter 10.